The abandoned cabin no one would enter held her for years. A Lakota chief walked right in. The smoke is what I noticed first. Not much of it. A thin thread, barely enough to darken the cold air above the tree line, gone before you could fix your eyes on where it came from. I was up on the ridge checking on a mare that had been favoring her left foreleg, and I saw it. Then it stopped. Then, 10 minutes later, a little more. Someone coaxing a fire that kept going out, working green wood or wet wood, struggling. I sat there on that horse for a long while, looking down at the tree line, then at the cabin just visible at its edge, then at the valley below where the town of Cutter's Bluff spread out brown and gray in the November light. Nobody in that town would touch that cabin. I knew that. My son Chayton had told me, not as a warning but the way you tell someone a fact about the ground, that the soil is clay past the creek, that the blackberries grow thicker on the south bank. He'd said, they leave that place alone. The woman in it, too. And he'd said it with something in his jaw that told me there was more behind the words than he was giving me. I was 61 years old that winter. I don't know what age I am now. I don't count years the way the settlers do, adding them up like coins. But 61 is close enough to what I was. My hair had gone gray at the temples 3 winters before. My right knee ached when the cold came in hard, and I had learned to read the weather in that knee better than any man reads a sky. I had led warriors. I had sat in council. I had watched the world I was born in to fold itself away like a blanket being put up for the last time, the edges tucked in, gone from reach. The Dawes Act had come down. The land was broken up, pieces handed out, pieces taken. There were papers with our names on them, English letters shaped into sounds that were not our sounds. There was a government man from Bismarck who wore 2 new boots and kept calling me Mr. Walking Crow. The Mr. said in the particular tone that means the opposite. My nephew Running Elk had gone to work at the tannery in Cutter's Bluff. 3 of my granddaughters were at the boarding school in Pierre, and when they came back last summer they smelled different, soap and something else, something I could not name, something like forgetting. I am not telling you this so you will feel sorry for me. I am telling you because you need to know what kind of man walked down off that ridge toward that cabin, what he had already carried for a long time, what his hands already knew. I came down through the ponderosa, the mare stepping careful over the frozen ground. I tied her at the back of the cabin out of sight of the road. I did not know what I would find. I had not planned to come down here at all. But the smoke was wrong, the rhythm of it was wrong, and a man who has lived as long as I had learns that wrong rhythms are the thing worth paying attention to. Everything else can wait. The door was wood gone gray and warped. It had a leather strap for a handle half-rotted. I knocked. Which might seem strange, knocking at a cabin that half the county believed was cursed, or haunted, or worse. But I was raised to knock. My mother, before everything, had taught me that a closed door belongs to whoever is behind it. Nothing. I knocked again. Then a sound, not words, a kind of a scrape, something being moved across a floor. I said in English because I had learned enough of it by then and because I did not know who was inside. I saw your fire going out. I thought I might help. Silence. Long enough that I began to think I had been wrong about everything. The smoke, the sound, all of it a story I'd told myself on a cold morning with nothing better to do. Then the door opened. She was, I don't know what I expected. I had heard things in town, fragments mostly, the kind of talk that gathers around a story when nobody actually knows the story. I had heard she was crazy. I had heard she was dangerous. I had heard her husband had died in that cabin of something nobody could name, and that she had stayed, and that people had tried to move her on and failed, and now they had simply stopped trying and had drawn a kind of circle around the whole place in their minds, outside of which she did not exist to them. She was not any of those things, or she was all of them, I still am not sure. She was a woman somewhere around 50, which meant she'd been young when she first came out here, younger than young. Brown hair mostly gone to silver. A face that had been outdoors for years, not weathered in the ruined way, but the way a stone gets when water has run over it a long time, smooth and particular. She was thin in the way that means she hadn't been eating enough, but she stood straight. There was nothing cowering about her. She looked at me for a long time without speaking. I looked back. She said, "You're Sela's walking crow." I said I was. She said, "I know who you are, Chayton's father. Half the valley knows who you are." I said, "Then you know I am generally harmless." She almost smiled. It was there and then it was gone, like the smoke had been here and then not. "My fire keeps going out," she said. "Wood's wet." "I can fix that," I said. She stood to one side of the door. I went in. The inside of that cabin it was not what people in town had imagined. I know what they imagined because in the months that followed I heard some of it, the stories that had built up around the place like old snow packing in a corner. They imagined squalor, madness made visible, something wrong with the air. What it actually was sparse, worn down to necessities. One chair, a table, a sleeping pallet, a cold fireplace full of wood that had not caught properly. On the table, a lamp she had been trying to conserve oil in, the wick turned so low the flame was barely a suggestion. On a shelf above the table, 3 books and a tin cup and a folded piece of paper I did not look at. On the floor near the sleeping pallet, boots that had been repaired so many times the repairs themselves had been repaired. It was the home of someone who had learned to need very little, and who had become very good at that. I looked at the fireplace first. The wood she'd been using was cottonwood, green, cut recent and not dried. She had some older pine split logs in a stack by the wall, but they'd gotten damp and she had not known how to bring them back. I went to work without talking much. I used the back of my belt knife to scrape the inside of the flue, checked the drawer, found she had it partly blocked from a wasp's nest in the upper part that had been there a long time. I knocked that loose with a stick. Then I rebuilt the fire from the bottom, using the driest slivers of the pine I could find, the interior cuts, the parts that had stayed drier, shaving them thin and building the bed the way you build any good thing, slow at the base, patient, giving the heat somewhere to go before you ask it to do more. She stood behind me and watched, didn't say anything, didn't offer to help, but not because she was rude. I had the sense she was watching to learn, cataloging what I was doing the way someone does when they intend to be able to do it themselves next time. When the fire caught and held, I heard her let out a breath, just one breath, quiet, but I heard it. I stood up and my knee gave me that familiar complaint, and I probably made a face because she said, "I have some willow bark. If you want it." I said that would be good. She moved to the shelf and got down a small cloth packet and put it in a tin with water and set it at the edge of the fire to heat. Efficient. No extra motion. The movements of someone who had been alone a long time and was used to being her own everything. I sat in the one chair she had, because there was nowhere else to sit, and she sat on the edge of the pallet, and the fire worked on the room. And after a while she gave me the tin with the willow bark tea, and it tasted like bark and nothing else, and it helped. She said, "You want to know why they leave me alone?" I said, "If you want to tell me." She looked at the fire for a while. Then, "My husband Ernie died in this cabin. 1874. He'd been sick a long time, his lungs, from the mine work he'd done before we came out here. I nursed him 3 years. When he went, people from town came and told me I should go back east, go to a sister or a cousin, go somewhere. I didn't go." She paused. "The first man they sent to make me leave, I threw a pot of boiling water at him. He left. A beat. Not the pot, the water." I said, "Did it burn him?" "Considerable," she said, without any particular regret. "The second man they sent," she continued, "I met at the door with a Spencer rifle that had been Ernie's and told him if he came onto my property I would use it. He left too." She looked at me. "I don't actually know if it still fires. I never tested it." I said, "Probably it does." "Probably," she said. "What is your name?" I asked her, because Chayton, when he'd spoken of her, had just said the woman. and nobody in town, in the fragments I'd heard, had used her name, had maybe stopped using it the way you stop using the name of something you've decided doesn't exist. She said, "Margaret, Ernie always called me Maggie. I've been Maggie my whole life." She stopped. "In this cabin I'm just myself. Nobody calls me anything in here." I said her name, Margaret, not Maggie. I said it because she had given it to me. She looked at me steady, and then she looked back at the fire. I went back 3 days later. I don't know exactly why. That is not entirely true, I know some of it. Part of it was the practical thing, that her wood situation was still wrong and winter had its teeth in proper now and the green cottonwood would not last her. Part of it was something else, something I had not felt in a while. The sense that a person needed what I could do, not what I used to be able to do, what I could do, with my hands, my back, my knowledge of what wood dried right and what water came clean from which spring and how to shore up a door frame that had warped. I was not a chief going to help a subject. I was not a man with something to prove. I was just a man who had something useful to do and someone who needed it done, and the distance between those two things being very short. I brought dry cottonwood from the stand on the east side of the ridge, split and seasoned. She did not say thank you right away. She looked at it, assessed how much of it there was, how it was split, how dry. Then she said, "That'll do." Which from her, I came to understand was high praise. I split more of what she had against the back wall. She came outside and worked beside me after a while, not speaking, picking up the split lengths and stacking them against the cabin under the overhang where they'd stay dry. We worked together for 2 hours without talking much. That was, I will tell you, that was something. The quiet working beside someone. It had been a long time. My wife Willow Leaf had died 4 years before. Pneumonia in a hard February. She had been the better half of everything we built together, and when she went a great deal of what I understood myself to be went with her. My sons were good men with their own families and their own burdens. My granddaughters were away at that school, and when they came back they sat a little further from me than they used to. I was not lonely exactly. I knew too many people, too many obligations came to my door, but I was alone in the way that counts, the way you're alone in the middle of a crowd. The way you're alone when you're only ever seen as what you were, and not what you are. Splitting that wood beside a woman who didn't know or care what I used to be, and needed what I could do right now, today, that was not a small thing. I came back the following week. And the week after that. It was Chayton who told me what had happened, the winter before I first saw the smoke. He came by my cabin in early December and he was in the mood he gets where he needs to talk but doesn't know how to start, so he drinks coffee and talks about other things until the right thing comes out. I waited. I know my son. Eventually he said, "You've been going out to the Hobarth place." Hobarth, that had been her husband's name, Ernie Hobarth. The place had his name on it still, even to people who'd never met him. I said I had. He was quiet for a little bit. Then, last winter, before the snow came in, 3 men from the Caldwell operation, you know the Caldwell operation, the cattle outfit. I said I knew of it. 3 of their men went out there. Not to be neighborly, Caldwell wants that land. The creek runs through it and they've wanted the water rights going on 5 years. They went out there to push her. He stopped. She's one woman, old, alone. They figured it would be easy. I waited. She wasn't there when they got to the cabin. She was up in the tree line with the Spencer. He rubbed the back of his neck. She put a round in the ground 10 feet in front of the lead man's horse. Horse went sideways into a fence post. Man broke his arm. He said this without emotion as a report. They left. They haven't gone back, but Caldwell's got connections with the county sheriff and everybody knows it, and it's only a matter of time before something more official comes along. I thought about that. About 3 men on horses, believing that size and numbers and the fact that nobody would stop them was enough. About a woman alone in a tree line with an old Spencer and the patience to wait them out. "Gunfire's all right then," I said. Chayton looked at me, apparently so. We drank our coffee. She know you've been going out there? He asked. She knows, I said. He nodded. Good. I said, what do you know about the county sheriff? Man named Burl Pitts, Caldwell's man in everything but name. He paused. He came through the reservation last spring, asking about the Hobarth property, whether anyone on our side had had dealings with her. I told him no. Why? Chayton looked at me with the look that says he is more like me than either of us usually acknowledges. Because it wasn't his business, he said, and because I didn't like his eyes. Sheriff Pitts came to the Hobarth cabin on a Tuesday in February. I know it was Tuesday because I had just come from a meeting at the agency on Monday, and I had stayed at Chayton's place that night. And in the morning Chayton's wife, Rosie, said something about it being the second week of the month, and I had counted back from there. I was not at the cabin when Pitts arrived. I was coming down the ridge road, the mare's breath clouding in the cold, when I saw the horses at the gate, 2 horses, one with the star and bar badge cloth hung off the saddle horn, the way Pitt's deputy always rode. I came down at the same pace I'd been going, not faster, not slower. I tied the mare at the gate beside their horses and walked up to the cabin. The door was open. I could hear Pitt's voice inside, that particular tone that belongs to men who believe their voice itself is an instrument of authority, loud not because the room is big but because loudness has always worked for them. He was saying something about a legal instrument, a court order, 60 days. I walked in. Pitts was a big man, running to weight in the way that happens when a man was once strong and has been eating well for a long time since. His deputy was young and thin, and looking at the ceiling as though the ceiling had done something fascinating, which told me the deputy was embarrassed to be here and was dealing with it by not quite being present. Margaret was standing at the window with her arms crossed and looking at Pitts the way she'd looked at the wet wood the first day, assessed, found wanting. Pitts heard me come in and turned around. When he saw me, something went across his face that was not quite recognition and not quite anything else. He had the look of a man recalculating. I said, "Morning, Sheriff." He said, "Walking Crow, not Mr., just the name the way you'd say it to a dog." I said, "What brings you out this way?" "County business," he said, "nothing to do with you." I looked at Margaret. She looked at me. Nothing in her face changed. She had the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a long time and knows the difference between a threat and the performance of a threat. I looked back at Pitts. I said, "The Hobarth property sits on a survey line I've been reviewing with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. There's a question about some of the eastern boundary going back to the original treaty parcels, so it may, in fact, have something to do with me." This was not entirely a lie. There was a boundary question. I had not been reviewing it, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs had enough papers in enough places that involving them in anything was like throwing sand in a clock. It didn't stop the clock, but it made it run slower. Pitts looked at me for a long moment. He was trying to decide if I was bluffing. The problem with deciding if someone is bluffing is that the decision itself costs you something: time, certainty, the picture of how things were going to go today. Pitts had come out here with a plan, and the plan was simple, and now it was no longer simple. I said I'd recommend not moving on anything with the property until the survey question's resolved. Could take some time. Bureau moves at its own pace. The deputy was very interested in the ceiling. Pitts said, "You got no authority here, Walking Crow." I said, "I didn't say I did. I said there was a survey question. Might want to run it by the county assessor before you file any instruments." He stared at me. I held his eyes. I had held the eyes of men much harder than Burl Pitts, and I knew what it felt like when the thing they'd come to do started to seem like more trouble than it was worth. He said to Margaret, not to me, "This isn't over." She said, "I didn't think it was." He left. The deputy followed, with genuine relief. We listened to the horses leave. Margaret uncrossed her arms. She went to the fireplace and put another piece of wood on and did not look at me. When she spoke, her voice was the same voice she always used, level, no extra weight on anything, but there was something underneath it, something that wasn't quite steady. She said, "Is there actually a survey question?" I said, "There are always survey questions if you look hard enough." She was quiet a moment. "Could be trouble for you, getting between Caldwell and what Caldwell wants." I said, "Caldwell wants water rights on land that belonged to your husband. Your husband's dead and you're still here and the land's still yours. Caldwell's problem is with arithmetic." She looked at me then. She had dark eyes, dark the way water over rock is dark, moving dark, something underneath. She said, "Why are you doing this?" I had thought about how to answer that, in the way you think about things before they are said, running through the true things and the things that sound like the true things and the space between them. I said, "Because it's right, because you were here first and you're still here and that means something." She looked at me a while longer. "That's not all of it," she said. She wasn't accusing me of anything. She saw things clearly. She always had. It was part of what made her who she was, sitting in that cabin alone for years and not losing the part of herself that could still see. I said, "No, it's not all of it." She waited. I said, "I am useful out here. I know what to do with wet wood and bad flues and survey instruments and men like Pitts. My sons don't need me the way you need me. My granddaughters are in Pier. My wife is gone 4 years. I stopped. It's good to be needed. It's good to have something to do that matters to someone. The fire popped. Outside, the wind came through the ponderosa on the ridge and made the sound pines make, the sound of a great breathing. She said, "You matter to people." I said, "I used to be a chief. Now I am a Dawes Act parcel number. It is different." She considered that for a long time. Then she said, "When Ernie died, I was nobody's wife anymore. I had been somebody's wife for 22 years and then I wasn't. People stopped knowing what to call me or how to look at me." She said it plainly, no self-pity in it, a fact like any other. "I understand different." We sat with that for a while, the fire doing its work between us. March came in hard, then broke early. The kind of break that makes you not trust it because you've been fooled before. But the days were longer and the south-facing slopes went bare and the mare felt it in her step. There is something about a horse when the winter breaks, the way they lift through the first real thaw, as though they too had been waiting and had not said so. I had started bringing things. Not charity things, Margaret would have handed them back, but trade things, useful things. Dried venison for the willow bark. Pine pitch for mending a leak in her roof. The pitch for the roof was my idea and she watched me do it. And then on the next leak she did it herself and didn't tell me she'd done it, but I could see it when I came in the spring to check. She had her own pride, and I respected it the same way I would respect it in a man, which is to say I noticed it and did not comment on it and worked around it. I was out back in late March, splitting the last of the green cottonwood that had finally had enough time to dry, when I heard horses on the road. More than 2, 4, maybe 5. I came around the front of the cabin. There were 4 men, none of them wearing badges. They had the look of hired work, not cowboys, not ranch hands, but the other kind, the kind that does the work you don't put a name to. They were stopped in front of the cabin gate, and one of them was looking at the cabin, and one of them was looking at me with the particular calculation of a man who sees a problem he didn't plan for. Margaret came out of the cabin behind me. I hadn't heard her, but she was there. She had the Spencer. I was holding the splitting maul. It is a heavy thing, a splitting maul, about 8 pounds of hickory and iron. I had been working with it for 2 hours and my shoulders and my bad knee had registered the fact, but I was still holding it, and I am told that even at 61 the way I stood with it was not the way a man stands when he is worried. The one who'd been looking at me said, "We're just here to talk." I said, "You brought 4 men to talk. We're from the Caldwell operation. I know who you're from." He looked at Margaret, he looked at the Spencer, he looked at me, he looked at the mall, he appeared to be doing arithmetic of his own. I said, "The survey question on this property is filed with the Bureau of Indian Affairs Field Office in Bismarck. The agent is a man named Theodore Harker. You or Mr. Caldwell want to contest anything about this property, that's where to start. Not here." Silence. "That's a long way to go," the man said. "It is," I agreed. He looked at his men, he looked back at me. "Caldwell's not going to let this go," he said. It was not a threat exactly. It was more like information he was giving me, as though he thought I might not know. I said, "He can take it up with Harker." And then I said, because it was true and I did not see the point of not saying it, "I am Sela's walking crow. My family has been on this land since before your employer was born. I was a Lakota chief when Caldwell was measuring out his first pasture. I have sat across a table from government men with the authority to take everything I own, and I am still sitting at tables. Mr. Caldwell is welcome to try." The man held my eyes for a moment, then he looked away, which is the important thing, that he looked away. They left. Margaret lowered the Spencer. I put down the maul. My shoulder was going to feel that in the morning. She said it quietly, not loud, not performed, "I've been here 16 years. Nobody ever stood in front of this gate for me." I said nobody else was here. She came off the porch. She walked over to where I was standing and she put her hand on my arm, just her hand on my arm, through the sleeve of my coat, light. And she looked at me the way she always looked at things, clear and direct. The way you look at something when you are seeing what it actually is and not what you need it to be. She said, "You're a good man, Sela's walking crow." I had been told I was a great man, a chief, impressive, formidable, useful in the way a tool is useful, wielded and set aside. I had been called all of those things. Nobody had called me a good man in, I could not remember how long. I said, "You're the only person on this whole valley who would walk to the door when I knocked." She said, "Then the valley is foolish." The trouble with Caldwell did not end that spring. I will not pretend it did, because that would make a neater story than the one that actually happened, and I have gotten to an age where I prefer what actually happened. What actually happened was that Caldwell filed a counterclaim with the county on the water rights. It went back and forth between county and bureau for 8 months. There were letters and replies to letters, and Chayton made 3 trips to Bismarck on my behalf, and Theodore Harker at the bureau turned out to be a meticulous man who did not like having his filings questioned, which made him inadvertently the best ally we had. In October the county backed down, not graciously. They back down the way people back down when they realize the cost is higher than they budgeted for, which is the only honest reason most people back down from anything. Margaret still has that land. She's still in that cabin. I helped her put a new door on it in the fall, a solid one that closes tight and keeps the drafts out. She helped me with it, held the frame level while I set the hinges, her arms steady for longer than most men's would have been. When we were done, she pushed it open and pulled it closed twice, testing the fit, and she said, "Good door," the same way she'd said "that'll do" about the wood, and that was that. I am at her cabin more often than I am at my own now. I do not know what name to put on that. I am not sure it needs one. There are things in this life that are what they are without needing a title. The way a fire is a fire. The way the ponderosa on the ridge breathes when the wind comes through. What I know is this. I am 61 years old or thereabouts. The world I was born to has gone through so many changes that sometimes I stand in the middle of it and cannot recognize the ground. I have watched things be taken and taken and taken again. And I know that the things that cannot be taken are smaller than I once thought and more important. The mare knows her way down the ridge now without being guided. She starts toward the tree line without being asked. There is a woman in a cabin at the edge of those trees who sees me when I come, who watches how I read the weather, who learns from watching and then does it herself and doesn't need to be told she did it right, who held my arm and looked at me straight and called me a good man, who handed me a tin of willow bark tea on a cold morning in November, as if that was the most natural thing, as if I was the kind of man people hand things to. I am the kind of man people hand things to. I always was. I just needed someone who could see it. The smoke comes up thin through the ponderosa when I'm on the ridge, her fire burning right now, warm and steady. I press my knee into the mare's flank and we go down through the trees toward the light.